Fighting erupted in Sudan in mid-April as rival generals looked to assert their authority over the country. Frantic efforts to evacuate foreign nationals put the conflict on the international agenda. But as the weeks have passed without a resolution, tens of thousands are displaced and the death toll is mounting. With us now for more, in Montreal, Quebec, Khalid Mustafa Medani, Chair of the African Studies Program and Associate Professor of Political Science at McGill University. And here in our studio, Nisrin Elamin, Assistant Professor of African Studies and Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for being on the program. Before we start talking about what's happening on the ground right now in Sudan, I just wanted to go over some key historical dates, and then we'll start our conversation. 1956, Sudan gains independence from British-Egyptian rule. Between 1955 and 1972, the First Sudanese Civil War broke out between North and South over demands for more regional autonomy by the Southern Sudan region. Between 1983 and 2005, the Second Sudanese Civil War breaks out between the Central Sudanese government and the Sudan People's Liberation Army. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir carries out a military coup, appoints himself president in 1993. Between 2003 and 2020, the war in Darfur between the Sudan Liberation Movement, the SLM, and the Justice and Equality Movement, JEM, rebel groups against the government, which they say is oppressing Darfur's non-Arab population. The government responds with a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Darfur's non-Arabs. The UN estimates up to 300,000 people are killed in the fighting. 2011, South Sudan gains independence following years of war with the central government in Khartoum. 2019, the army ousts President al-Bashir after months of protest against his rule, leading us to today, in 2023. A power struggle within the military government sees fighting break out between the regular army and members of the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. I also want to pull up a map of Sudan, located in Northeast Africa. It is the third largest country by landmass in Africa. It has a population of 46 million people, and the capital city is Khartoum. Nisrin, you were there. You were able to get out. Can you tell us about what happened?
Sure. I mean, we woke up on April 15th to the sound of gunfire in Khartoum and had to shelter in place, and found out soon after that the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces had started fighting. These two factions of the military coup regime essentially were vying for political and economic control of the country, and we were all caught in the middle of this. And so as days went by, we decided to evacuate from the neighborhood in Khartoum that we were in that was particularly hard hit to my father's village, an hour south of Khartoum. And then eventually we took a sort of long, difficult journey to Port Sudan, where we evacuated by ship. And I think, the important point to make here is that the majority of people, including many in my own family, were not able to evacuate for, security reasons, but also for financial reasons. It's been incredibly expensive to leave the city, but also very difficult because none of the ceasefires that have been negotiated have actually held.
I just want to do a quick follow-up. I'm so glad that you're here. You were able to evacuate with your young child, 3. What was that like to leave your family while you were seeking refuge for your child?
I mean, it was incredibly difficult. My parents thankfully evacuated with us, and they're not U.S. citizens, so I would have never left without them. So that was a relief. But my aunts, uncles, cousins, many people are still there, and it's heartbreaking to see what's happening.
It must be very hard at night thinking about their safety.
Yeah.
Khalid, can you give us an idea of what's happening on the ground? We know that the Sudanese military and a paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, are currently fighting for control of the country. What are the main factors that led to this crisis?
Well, there are a number of factors, but Sudanese like to go back, if you don't, if you will allow me, to 1989, when the emergence of the Islamic authoritarian regime of Omar Bashir took over power. And there were two policies that they implemented that have a great deal to do with the present conflict. One of them was their policy, very clear, to dominate the local economy, including the mineral economy of Sudan. The other one, which is directly related to the present conflict, is what we call, I suppose, in political science, coup-proofing. A policy in which the Bashir regime, the Islamic authoritarian regime, decided to weaken the National Standing Army by factionalizing the security apparatus. Emerging from that factionalization, initially in the early 2000s, was the Janjaweed that you probably heard of and many of your viewers would be familiar with. That Janjaweed militia was the creation of the Islamist regime of Omar Bashir, and he utilized it to put down insurgencies in Darfur. But also, very importantly, this militia was used historically to also put down dissent. The idea was to forestall any military coup against the Bashir regime, and at the same time also put down any dissent in civil society fighting for democracy. These are the two important factors that lead us up to what is extremely important, and that, of course, is the revolution of 2018 and 2019. But that was unprecedented, as your viewers and the whole world was watching. Millions of Sudanese took not only to the streets of Khartoum, but throughout the country, overthrowing almost impossibly this very strong authoritarian regime of Omar Bashir in April of 2019. Following that, we see the trajectory of what unfortunately is happening now. And that is initially the cooperation and partnership between Burhan, the head of the National Army, and his deputy at the time, the head of the militia, the Rapid Support Forces, by the name of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who cooperated to undermine the efforts towards a transition to civilian democracy. In fact, very importantly, in October 2021, they upended that entire experiment and the path towards a democratic civilian government by waging a coup. They were at that time in partnership. Following that, Nisrin can add to that, and I know she knows it full well, Sudanese at the grassroots continued to mobilize on a daily basis against this military coup, forcing, in the context of initial support from the international community, forcing these two generals to get to the table and negotiate something called the Framework Agreement. There are a number of different stipulations of the agreement. Let me just focus on one that has led us to this tragic conflict.
Let me come back to that, but you did mention, these two groups are fighting, and caught in between that are the people of Sudan. Nisrin, what has life been like for people in Sudan since the fighting broke out last month?
I mean, I want to just make clear that, we're talking about a city, Khartoum, that is home to almost 7 million people. It's a mega city, very densely populated, and essentially the Rapid Support Forces have been using civilians as a human shield. They've been, occupying people's homes, embedding themselves in the neighborhood that we were in, and as a result, people are being bombed, essentially, just gunfire constantly, and hospitals have been destroyed or are no longer operating. Very few of them are. And so, it's very difficult to access food, water. Electricity and water has been out in many parts of Khartoum. And also in Darfur, there are many towns and cities in Darfur that are also impacted by this violence. And it's, basically people are under siege.
I'm going to come back to you in just a second, because when we talk about what's happening in Sudan, there is a humanitarian crisis happening right now. The fact that people can't access water, they can't access food, you have to kind of stay where you are for fear that you will be killed. Khalid, what is the concerns around the region and maybe this crisis causing the region to have instability?
Well, I think it's really a huge concern. Initially, no one could have predicted the kind of quick expansion of the conflict. But you have a country, as you showed in your map, that is neighbored by 7 different countries. It borders the Sahel region, which has historically, over the past couple of decades, been very volatile. Crucially, it, of course, borders South Sudan, undergoing its own conflict, and of course, Ethiopia, that is also undergoing civil conflict. And the refugee flows are extremely important. And very, very importantly, of course, Sudan borders the very strategic Red Sea and Indian Ocean area. Once the conflict began to expand, the international community, whether it's the United States, Canada, a host of, and Saudi Arabia, of course, began to see not only the huge humanitarian crisis, but from their perspective, also the problem of spillover, not only in the Sahel, but the very strategic Red Sea area. And this, I would argue, is what, unfortunately, one of the main, just as much as we're focusing on the humanitarian crisis, for those regional countries and also external actors, their focus increasingly is on the strategic issues associated with the potential of a spillover in a very volatile part of the world, and particularly a strategic part of the world, the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea area. And historically, many countries have vied to establish bases and strategic control in that part of the world. And so that's why there's great international concern with respect to the conflict in Sudan.
And Nisrin, it's also been reported the Russian mercenary group Wagner has been supplying Sudan's rapid support forces with missiles to aid their fight against the country's army. The RSF has denied this. But is this worsening tensions?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to be clear here that while this is not an externally orchestrated war, it's definitely externally supported, right? You have, as you mentioned, the RSF getting arms and fuel. There are credible reports of that through Libya, through General Haftar, who's in turn supported by the UAE and Russia. And on the other side, we have the Sudanese armed forces that are being supported by Egypt. And, I think going back to this humanitarian crisis, we have a basically non-existent humanitarian response from the international community. I mean, it's been too little, too late. And the people who are actually providing life-saving support right now to civilians are resistance committees in different neighborhoods across Khartoum and in other parts of the country that were at the forefront of the popular resistance against not only al-Bashir, but this military coup regime that is currently essentially fighting each other, right? And these are really the people that from the very beginning have been asking for a full transition to democratic rule, and they've been sidelined in this protracted process of negotiations that has always been tipped in favor of the military. There hasn't really, they haven't been, as I said, these resistance committees, they've really been sidelined in this process, and even in the negotiations that happened over the weekend in Jeddah, there were no civilian actors. The civilian actors that were part of this protracted negotiation process that was then, derailed through this fighting have been hand-picked civilian elites that don't really represent the kind of popular demands of the people, which is that we transition to full democracy. You
mentioned the international response. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But Khalid, we've heard about these ceasefires being enacted, but they've not been upheld. As of right now, is there a clear way out of this crisis in Sudan?
I don't think there's a clear way out of the crisis at the moment, but in terms of the implementation of the ceasefire, the Jeddah talks, of course, if you read the statement, is really about trying to comply rhetorically to international humanitarian law. In other words, it's a kind of propaganda method or tool on the part of both generals. And in fact, they didn't go themselves; they sent a delegation. I think that I want to just emphasize what Nisrin said. The way out in the short term, of course, is putting pressure on these generals to allow humanitarian access. They're trying to get people out of Khartoum rather than actually help people in Khartoum. And you can see that clearly in the statements. They want basically people to leave in order to vie for military control of the city and the country. That, from my perspective, has to be understood in the sense that we have to, or the international community must put extra pressure. And then what Nisrin said is really crucial. If you don't mind me saying, the very concept of conflict resolution that is being applied is problematic in the sense sense that we know in other contexts in Africa, Sierra Leone, Liberia, that the role of civil society and the expansion of those kind of actors in negotiations is the only way to actually have a durable solution. And that is because these two generals have very limited constituency in Sudanese civil society. If they had greater popularity and greater constituency, there could be a potential of one of them stabilizing the country through authoritarian means. But we know from the history of Sudan and what Nisrin just mentioned, that that is actually not the possibility. The majority of Sudanese are completely opposed to both of them for a variety of reasons. And the only way we've seen in other post-conflict settings that these kind of wars stop is actually, believe it or not, expanding the role of civil society actors who have the legitimacy in civil society in order to actually, realize a durable peace. And I think I look to the African examples as we look forward in terms of the resolution of this conflict.
Nisrin, just to build on what Khalid was saying, do you see a scenario that could lead to a civilian democratic path for the country?
I mean, that's the only way out of this. I think what this moment should teach us is that we should have never put two criminals who are responsible for war crimes that span decades, not only in Darfur, but also the Nuba Mountains in South Sudan, at the negotiation table. They should have been tried. And in fact, what happened, especially in this post-coup, post the October 2021 coup, is that they've been repeatedly legitimized and framed as potential reformists when they've proven time and time again that they cannot be trusted. Anytime we got closer to kind of civilian, to tipping the power slightly more in favor of the civilians, they would either stage a massacre at a sit-in that was essentially demanding, regime change, or stage a coup. So there's always been proof, right, that they cannot be trusted, and yet we keep putting them at the negotiation table. We keep propping them up. In many ways, the Jeddah talks, to me, were essentially a green light for them to continue fighting.
Green light for
these two generals to keep fighting, because peace was never on the table. How can you have talks, right, that don't put peace on the table? What we really need right now is a coordinated international response that, as Khalid said, I think, to me, I put more faith into the African Union and the IGAD. There was a process that preceded this one in South Sudan that got derailed through the Jeddah talks, right? And so I think we really need an international coordinated response, not only to get a humanitarian response on the ground, but also to pressure these generals into stopping fighting. And that has to come through, we need to stop externally funding them, right? That needs to stop immediately. We need to freeze their assets. And eventually they need to be tried, right? That's what needs to happen. And for me, the only way forward is to really heed the call of the popular democratic forces on the ground, the resistance committees, the unions that have been the backbone of the revolution. They have a blueprint for the way forward. It is not up to us, I think, in the diaspora to even talk about what the next steps are. They know very well. We need to listen to them, and we need to have them kind of guide any type of international engagement moving forward, because the international engagement that preceded this has, in my view, merely legitimized these war criminals and brought us closer to this moment.
Well, you mentioned the diaspora. Khalid, before we started taping, I was speaking to Nisrin about how I saw what was happening in Sudan unfold on Twitter. I didn't see it necessarily on the news until weeks later, but on Twitter, people saying this is what's happening, and finding out that the people who were able to leave, like you said, people who had passports, but people, if you don't have a passport or a visa, you're essentially stuck. What kind of impact has the crisis in Sudan had on the diaspora here in Canada?
Well, I think, Nisrin outlined it. I think you can imagine the kind of both psychological toll and also the deep concern for family members. All of us have immediate and extended family. Even as some of our relatives leave, the majority remain. And so there is a constant, not only, feeling of concern, but anxiety. And of course, what I want to say is because of that, what I have seen is a remarkable mobilization of Sudanese diaspora. I've been talking to 4 groups just yesterday. There are upwards now of 22 diasporic Sudanese Canadian organizations. All of them have put together this kind of alliance and umbrella group in order to try to help not only Sudanese in Canada to reconcile with their relatives, but even equally important, trying to lobby the Canadian governments and others to allow Sudanese to come and expedite the asylum process so they can come in. And of course, in addition to that, help with resettlement. This, of course, as you know full well, has been very successful in other humanitarian cases. And what I've seen, which I have not seen before, and I've been in the US and Canada for some time at different years, is the remarkable mobilization and unity. I am giving you talking points that the Sudanese Canadian community has actually, forwarded to me. It's absolutely remarkable. There's a branch of the Sudan Doctors Union. There are the Sudanese Canadian Associations, which is a grassroots organization throughout Canada that's mobilizing. And tomorrow, all of them are meeting in order to put all of this effort under one unified umbrella in order to make the case that, we need to expedite asylum cases. We need to expedite reconciliation of families, Sudanese Canadians who need their family here. Because as Nisrin said, even if you have the finances, and most don't, there is absolutely no way to actually get cash. And another aspect, of course, is to engage with the Canadian government in order to provide medical supplies. That is something that, for example, the Sudanese Doctors Union, that has a branch in Canada, is working tirelessly for. So there's a lot to be done. And the people taking the lead on this are 22 different organizations in Canada.
You mentioned Canada, Khalid. Sorry to interrupt. You mentioned Canada, and I'm curious, in your view, has the Canadian response been adequate?
I don't think it's been adequate, but I do think it's a learning process because I began these interviews and discussions with them at the very beginning. I think there's been a movement in terms of taking seriously Canadians who may not be diplomatic staff, essential staff, Sudanese who carry Canadian passports and permanent residents. I think there's been a shift to that. That allows me to think that there's a great deal of hope that the Canadian government will understand. I've spoken to a couple of them that this is a grave humanitarian crisis, very similar to others that have happened recently. And
Nisrin,
the next step,
I would love to get Nisrin's input on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to appeal to the Canadian government to do more to evacuate people from Sudan who have family in Canada, but also others who might seek asylum. We're not talking about huge numbers here, and there have been special visa arrangements made for Ukrainians, for example, that could serve as a model for what's happening in Sudan. I also think it's important for the Canadians, like everybody else, to try to add pressure to cease fighting. If we don't stop this fighting, we can't get closer to where we need to get, which is full democracy. And I think the other thing that I want to mention is that there are also some, as Khalid mentioned, Sudan has gold, it has oil, mostly in South Sudan, but it has natural resources that people are interested in, including Canadian mining companies have played a role in Sudan in the past. The Port Red Sea region is a strategic area that people are interested in. So, in many ways, Sudan has been sort of viewed as a place to extract things from, right? And that's really undermined any form of democracy. And Canadians, I think, need to be aware of the fact that there's, for example, a PR firm that is based in Montreal that, for a short period of time, actually represented the Rapid Support Forces, right? And so there are, corporate and other kinds of interests that we also need to expose and shame, and that needs to stop.
Khalid, I'll give you the last 30 seconds.
The last 30 seconds, I just want to reemphasize what Nisrin said, and that is there's a very good chance to understand the political economy of this conflict and the financing and fuel that gives the opportunity to both Burhan and Hemeti to engage in this horrible war. I think there's a great deal of advancement in terms of understanding where this funding comes from, the accounts. All of that technology has advanced very much in recent years. We know where they're getting support from and financing from, and I think that addressing that very seriously. And finally, of course, as Nisrin also mentioned initially, this time there must be, whether it's going to happen or not, we have to keep saying a coherent international response that really takes seriously the different interests that different actors have with respect to these generals.
Khalid, Nisrin, thank you so much for helping us understand what's happening in Sudan, and our thoughts are with the people of Sudan. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you for covering what's happening in Sudan.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.